Cursebreaker Faceted by Melinda Kusira. Dedication for Carolyn K. Rest in peace, sis. O guardian most dear. Life's sweetness is lost. Consumed by sorrow. Keep grief from ruling all my tomorrows. O guardian most dear. Traditional Shayar and prayer. Prepare to be fascinated. Hi readers. The cast of the Cursebreaker series would like to welcome you to the book you've been waiting for, Cursebreaker Faceted, the third book in our series. If you haven't read the first two books, Cursebreaker Enchanted and Cursebreaker Darkens, you can still enjoy the mayhem that is Faceted, but there will be a few references that fly over your head. At some point, you'll want to catch up. And before we unleash our story on you, we'd like to thank our newsletter subscribers for helping us get this book out to you. Give them a round of applause. They deserve it. Each week for 2 months they solved riddles left by the corporate goons who snatched our mild-mannered scribe, Melinda Kusira, and our book. With their help, we found Faceted and deployed it so we could get it out to you. But we still haven't found our scribe. Our search continues each week, and we're counting on you to help. If you haven't already, sign up for the only character-run newsletter of its kind at mkucsera.com/welcomecharacters, and let us entertain you each week with our out-of-book shenanigans. Now without further ado, we bring you Cursebreaker Faceted. Magical Spies. Witches and woe, the spy knows, life's shadows, mirrors, and lost troves. Old Shayar and proverb. This is not a fun adventure. Rand poked Sarn in the ribs. I know, and I'm sorry. Sarn peered around the stack of crates, screening them from view, and fought the urge to punch something. Dirk and his 4 cronies rounded a bend and vanished from sight. How could they still be at liberty? He'd reported them to Gerlo and Nolo 4 weeks ago. Why hadn't they informed the guards? What did he have to do, catch these fools red-handed? He had back in May, but no arrests had been made. Granted, policing fell outside the purview of the Rangers, but Gerlo should have reported my findings to the guard captain. Sarn gnashed his teeth in frustration. Crouching low, he checked out their situation on his head map. Rand poked him again, interrupting his speculation. You promised a nice adventure. Shish, we don't want them to hear us. They're bad people, remember? They are. Rand clamped one hand on Sarn's shoulder and stood on tiptoe to peer over the crates. I don't see anyone. They entered a storeroom. Well, their icons had. What were they doing in there? Something illegal. Sarn's hopes rose. Maybe he could summon the guards and let them tidy up the last piece of the nightmare marring his best friend's death. Can we go? You can't see them. Rand tugged Sarn's arm, intent on towing him if necessary. The sight of his 4-year-old son trying to budge him startled a laugh out of Sarn. It was so unexpected. He met his son's determined green eyes, and reality smothered his mirth. If he summoned a guard, what would happen to Rand? Few knew the boy existed. Sarn chewed the inside of his cheek as he checked his head map again, but other than show the positions of all 5 men, it gave him no further insight. And why should it? Since when was his magic ever helpful? An image overtook his sight. In it, a terrified Rand plummeted toward an endless spiral of stairs. Sarn closed his eyes, unable to forget the magic tearing out of him to catch his son. Point taken, you are helpful sometimes. The memory crumpled into a ball, then a tongue of emerald flame consumed it, as his magic resumed its sulk. It wasn't a fan of the whole surveillance thing either. I want to go out now. This is boring. Rand kicked a crate. Yeah, it is, but I have to do this. Sarn sighed and ran a hand through his hair, dislodging his hood. Maybe his son was right. The longer they stayed here, the more likely they would be discovered. Besides, 4 weeks of on-and-off surveillance had turned up nothing, not a single box of angel's dust beyond the one he'd reported a month ago, But those creeps had to be involved in the murderous mess back in May, and they'd pay for their part. If he could just convince someone in a position of authority of their wrongdoing, Dirk and his friends would be arrested before his secret could come out. And his son would be safe. Why do you have to do this? How to explain to a 4-year-old about drugs, murder, and demons? You remember Shade, right? At his son's nod, Sarn continued. Well, it's partly their fault he's dead. And partly Shade's fault too. Sarn glanced over the waist-high stack of crates. He should entertain his son instead of endangering the boy. What the hell was he doing here? Rand's unblinking gaze asked the same question. Gerlo's words repeated like heartburn, and Sarn cringed. Who died and made you lead investigator? Maybe I should move along and find something more constructive to do. But Dirk and company had to be part of the illegal alial trade. Grief tightened Sarn's chest and closed his throat. The drug had addled his demon-ridden friend and contributed to Shade's death and 13 others. More innocent lives would become entangled in that same hallucinogenic web if someone didn't stop this. Papa? Rand poked him. Sarn put an arm around his son. At 4 years old, Rand was a real pip and precocious too. Judging by his furrowed brow, Rand was thinking hard about something, never a good sign. Why are we here? Because I know they're up to something bad. And their victims deserve justice. Sarn rubbed his chest, but the pain remained. He would speak for them, the drugged out, their shattered families and the dead. Because no one else would. His fist tightened, securing that promise. As if cued, Sarn's sixth sense fired off a warning. He skulked behind a full pallet, his mystified son at his side. Rand needed the sacks shielding them from view. How do you know that? Know what? For a second, Sarn had no idea what his son was talking about. His mind had drifted back to the dead and their loved ones. Rand shot him an annoyed look, which he deserved. That they're up to something bad. Trust his son to ask the hard questions. I just know. Now hush, something's happening. Before Rand could ask what, Sarn covered his son's mouth. 5 icons on his head map headed in this direction, Dirk and his compatriots. Panic rose, but Sarn fought it with cold logic. They were hidden in the middle of a recent shipment of goods. No one saw us arrive, so no one knows we're here. Sarn told himself, but he didn't believe it. Dirk was a canny bastard. And the shipment itself raised questions. Where did the shippers find so much non-ensorcelled wood? Not in Shayari. Her forests were 90% enchanted and intelligent enough to kill axe-wielding men. Yet he was surrounded by wood of the non-enchanted variety, despite the impossibility of it. Where had it come from? Could it be illegal? The bells of Mount Eredrin rang 13 times. Rand's fingers twitched as he counted the peals. Standing on tiptoe again, Rand whispered 13 in Sarn's good ear, followed by, I'm hungry. Of course he was. Rand was always hungry. Sarn nodded, and his stomach gurgled a request for lunch. Maybe he should stop for now and come back later. Sarn consulted his map again. Where were these jokers going? Not toward him and his son. I should follow and find out. I'm hungry. Rand poked Sarn again. And maybe I should fetch my son some lunch. Sarn sighed. Why was nothing ever easy? Because he was a 20-year-old single parent, and his orphaned upbringing did him no favors. We'll go in a few minutes. I just want to see what they're up to. Rand scowled. You promise? Thanks to the magic in his blood, promises were binding. So instead of answering, Sarn crept down the cluttered tunnel, sliding between stacks of numbered crates. He paused at each one long enough to commit its numerical sequence to the 100 already in his memory. They might be important. As the additions settled into their slots, Sarn froze. A pattern had been building since his first visit back in May, and it was now ironclad. He glanced at the new containers and identified each one's contents except one. Sarn approached the box whose number diverged from the pattern. He had to open it, but he had nothing to open it with except magic, and that could get complicated. Voices stopped Sarn. He dropped into a crouch and pulled his son close to his body, quieting the unhappy boy. Miles of naked stone bounced every word Dirk and his cronies uttered, turning their conversation into a jumble of meaningless sounds. Sarn cursed his ill luck. Partial deafness in one ear did him no favors. There was one other way to glean information, but should he risk it? Sarn mulled the idea over while his son fidgeted. Not seeing any other choice, he gritted his teeth and touched the stone floor. Magic surged out of his hand, and green fire raced down the tunnel. Information threatened to wash his consciousness away in its sparkling cascade. The glow of his green eyes increased, giving away his position until he squeezed his eyes closed. "Let go, Papa. I want to play with the magic." Rand squirmed, but to no avail. Controlling the magic took all his concentration, so Sarn shook his head. He fought to keep the magic from crawling over the crates and up the walls. The damn thing wanted to investigate every rock and crevice. But he kept steering it toward the sixth man shapes lighting up his map. His magic had already identified 5 of the men present: Dirk, Ragnus, Chryso, Gorfin, and VR. Who was the 6th? His magic walked up the newcomer's legs, investigating her body for clues, but it sent none back. Something about her made his magic recoil. Other than her gender and presence, Sarn received nothing more about her. So he pulled on the magic, forcing it to return, but it fought him and strained to delve deeper on its own mission. The Lithirians, his magic whispered in an eerie repeat of last month's mental tussle. They're dead and dusted. But Sarn's magic refused to listen to him. And why should it? What was he but its untrained bearer? After he dealt with Dirk and company, he had to make time to fix that. You need to play with the magic, Rand had said last month, and his son was right. But the idea chilled Sarn, so for now, he imagined the magic as a radiant green cloth furled inside him. And shock of shocks, after one more assay, his magic receded. Sarn exhaled the breath he'd been holding. How long before his magic won the contest of wills? He rubbed his aching forehead. Not long, judging by the pain pounding in his skull. Maybe if I slept more, I'd have less difficulty. Aralor resisted the urge to draw on the 5 men. Live steel might improve the discourse, or at least hurry it along. Her 40-ish interlocutor, Dirk was it, looked like he'd lost a battle with a statue. Plaster coated his clothes, and sweat had smeared the dust into a sticky paste. Every time the gray-streaked leader opened his mouth, excuses fell out. Aralor squeezed the hilt of her sword, but none of the sheep ogling her noticed thanks to her 2 long sleeves. A garden had thrown up on the dress she wore, creating a hideous floral pattern. But while wearing the garish thing, no one gave her a second glance. Not even these fools. Its ugliness fit right in with the decor of the mountain stronghold. Why did people live in this crazy place? Its ancient builders had been insane. They'd carved an entire city inside a mountain instead of on top of it, which would have been the smart thing to do. And she needed these idiots to hurry the hell up. She had deadlines to meet, a prelate to greet, and an important test to conduct. Time was wasting, but she fought the urge to tap her foot. Giving away her impatience would only slow things down. She fixed her gaze on the leader of this rabble. Where is it? Either you can deliver what you promised, or you can't. Make up your damned mind already. So she could slay them all, and be done with this ridiculous errand. Aralor eyed the other 4 men and sized them up. Please give me an excuse to exercise my blade. It's thirsty. In her pocket, she had a sample of the cure for all that was wrong with Shayari. But did she have sanction to use it? No. Nor did she have a pure enough sample to make a dent in the magic saturating her homeland. But her initial tests were intriguing enough to warrant acquiring more, a lot more. That's why she was here in this disturbing place, talking to a bunch of fools unworthy of her exalted presence. Patience wins all duels. Aralor tightened her grip on the leather-wrapped hilt until her knuckles complained. Short-sighted fools ran her order. Let them. She knew what needed to be done. And she would do it as soon as these louts handed over more of the cure for Shayari's magical ills. Then Shayari would burn. Her hand relaxed, and a smile quirked her lips until she caught the tail end of Dirk's speech. Her sword left its scabbard so fast it blurred. She tapped Dirk's throat right below his Adam's apple. One flick of her wrist and his thick neck would be missing a head. So tempting. I am not some doe-eyed chit swayed by posturing or pretty words. Produce or die. You can't take all of us on, said a rotund fellow cleaning his nails with a knife to Dirk's right. He leaned against a pallet. His dark eyes dismissed her as nothing more than a slender girl in a frilly skirt. Arlor rolled her eyes at his machismo. If you want to bet your life on my skill, so be it. With her offhand, she threw the dagger hidden up her other sleeve. It slammed point first into the pallet, pinning his arm. Shall I toss again? Or have I made my point? This she directed at Dirk, whose face colored under the plaster. Or was it flour dusting his person? You've made your point. His glare appended a silent psycho bitch to the end of his statement. A seeker on her own is never alone as long as she's doing God's work. You'd better remember that. With a flourish, Arlor sheathed her sword and hid a smile at the hostile glares Dirk's friend shot her. At least they now understood their position. Yes, she represented a religious order, one with militant roots and aspirations of civil strife. In times of crisis, people found faith. Since God did not always provide said strife, his faithful had to light the pyre and burn down the establishment for him. All Arlor required now was that brand. You have 2 hours to get me more of this. Arlor withdrew a black stone from her pocket and cradled it in the palm of her hand. Its matte facets drank in the light, dimming the ever-present Lumiere crystals studding the ceiling. They were another anomaly, another symptom of the magic plaguing Shayari's green miles. But they would soon be gone. Swear you will get what I want. Swear it on this stone. Shadows swelled in the corners of the room, discomfiting the 4 men and their spokesman. Arlor held herself rigid by an exercise of will. Any good Shayaran knew darkness was not just the enemy of light but the call sign of the adversary. Invoking it came with risks, but Shayari teetered. With one good shove, it would fall, ushering in a rebirth free of magic, so technology could take its rightful place as the prime mover of the future. Holding to her belief, she steeled herself to play with the devil's rocks. A ghostly surprise. Papa, I want to go now. I'm scared. Rand huddled close, pressing his small body tight against Sarn's side. Something had changed the dynamic down here. Shadows strengthened, growing larger and bolder. They tapped gray fingers against the ceiling-bound Lumiere crystals, and they dimmed. But that was impossible. Once kindled by magic, Lumiere crystals could glow for thousands of years. Sarn stared at them. His breath misted as the temperature dropped. Rand shivered, and he rubbed his hands down his son's back. Friction warms, so did activity, so Sarn skulked around a tower of crates searching for the source of that frigid air. While never warm, these subterranean tunnels usually stayed well above freezing even in winter, but it was summer now. Where had the Arctic chill pebbling his skin come from? The same place as last month when you faced a demon. Fear gripped Sarn and shook him. No, the demon was gone, either destroyed or banished back to its realm. This chill had another cause. Had a new evil taken the demon's place? He'd never verified that his best friend was the only possessed person living under this mountain. Did I just spend 4 weeks chasing the lesser evil? Sarn shuddered at the thought, and in his arms his son whimpered as the cold stole through his thin clothes. Let there still be time to stop whatever horror this demon was working. Sarn stripped off his cloak and wrapped it several times around his son before clasping the cocooned child against his racing heart. Rand snuggled into his embrace. Can we go now? Sarn gave his son a distracted nod. We'll go as soon as I get some answers. Rand groaned at the delay. If Dirk's consorting with demons, I need proof and to somehow stop it. Not a pleasant thought, but Sarn gritted his teeth and made peace with the possibility. Unbidden, the Queen of all Trees call sign sprang to mind, and his fingers itched to trace those interconnected circles. Inside his heart, a pure white flame burned, yearning for release. Sarn shook himself free of the partial trance. What was going on in the storeroom with the unknown woman? How was she connected to Dirk and company, and what were they doing? Staying low, Sarn wended around pallets and towers of casks, moving ever closer to the open door and the answers to his questions. A tongue of white light licked up from the ground in front of Sarn. The luminance shaped itself into a boy of perhaps 8 years who shook his head. Sarn froze and fought the pull of a gaze lock. One glance into that ghost's eyes would tax his sanity too much, so Sarn cast his eyes elsewhere. I don't want to know what comes next. I don't want to know. In his arms, Rand squirmed to get a better look at the specter. All Sarn's unanswered questions came roaring back as Rand freed a hand and extended it toward the apparition. Before the thing could disintegrate, Sarn backed away holding his son tight. It was the ghost of the boy who died a month ago. The same ghost who had haunted him for 3 days until he'd solved the riddle of the boy's death. But it had crossed over. Why had it come back to haunt him? What do you want? Sarn asked the ghost boy, knowing full well any answer it gave would never reach his ears. Death hung a veil of silence between the living and the dead, one no being on either side of the divide could breach. You passed on. Or at least Sarn thought the ghost had when it disappeared with the Queen of all Trees. She was a psychopomp or something. Sarn swallowed the knot of grief choking him and blinked back tears. She'd taken shade too. Memories rose from their graves lit by her silver radiance, and her proud trunk ushered the slayers and slain alike toward a luminous wavy line. Beyond it lay a far green country set aside for the dead. Or so Nolo had claimed, but was he right? Sarn blinked and the memory receded, leaving him with a chest constricted by sorrow and an unhappy child squirming in his arms. He shifted his grip to keep his son from falling. Rand shot him an annoyed glare and kept right on struggling, determined to touch the ghost. The ghost boy spread his thin arms to block the storeroom where Dirk and company conducted their mysterious business. What's going on in there? Sarn had to find out. What don't you want me to see? And why? A month ago, the ghost had driven Sarn crazy until he'd figured out what was going on. Why now did it advocate ignorance? What had changed its mind? Far from deterring Sarn, the ghost boy's visit cemented Dirk and his goons' guilt. Whatever they were mixed up in had to be awful to drag a ghost back from the lands of Ever, if that's where the ghost boy had ended up. Confirming his guess, the ghost boy's washed-out green eyes implored Sarn to leave this place and let this mystery go. How could he when he knew something nefarious was afoot? Sarn shook his head. Ignorance was more dangerous than knowing, especially here. Sarn crouched behind a tower of crates but hesitated before freeing a hand. Would another attempt result in a loss of consciousness? Blacking out now would risk not just his safety but his son's too. But the mystery won. Sarn lowered his hand until it touched the ground, and knew on contact he'd made a mistake. Magic rushed out of his core, down his arm and out of his hand so fast his sight dimmed. A black tendril curled around his magic and yanked on it. Sarn's knees hit the ground and he fell sideways into the darkness, draining the green light inside him. For a moment, a black pinpoint somewhere inside the storeroom floated as it drank his magic in, ripping it out of his blood and bones. What the hell is that thing? Under him, the mountain shook, and someone screamed at him to get up. Sarn met the startled eyes of the ghost boy staring over his frightened son's shoulder, then the world blackened. Papa, wake up. Rand shook him, but he stayed unconscious. Why won't Papa wake up? Rand looked to the ghost boy for an answer, but the ghost had gone away when he wasn't looking, just like Mama. Mama. Rand wiped hot tears from his eyes. She would know what to do, but Mama wasn't here. He had to save Papa on his own. Rand squared his shoulders and looked for a way. Papa's magic snaked across the floor in fat green ribbons, moving too fast and too bright to be right. All the magic flowed out of his hand. Breaking that connection might turn off the magic, and doing so might rouse Papa. Relieved he had a plan, Rand pried at Papa's fingers until he broke the connection. Green light stopped pouring out of Papa, but he didn't wake up. Instead, convulsions racked him. Ran held tight until Papa stopped thrashing. He touched Papa's forehead, but his skin was cool and clammy, no fever. Ran bit his lip. Papa had these fits often, but no one ever said why, not even Papa, who didn't know he had them. Was Papa dying? Mama had gone away in March, but Papa was a lot younger than her and magical. Still, the question haunted Ran as he buried his head in his unconscious father's chest. Was Papa dying? If so, why would no one tell him? Thoughts of death weighed Ran down, bowing his shoulders until they shook with silent tears. Papa shifted, and his arm curved around Ran, gathering him tight against a heart still beating with love but not magic. Why wouldn't Papa wake up? Swear it! Aurelore bellowed. Her shout echoed off the stone walls of the storeroom. Dirk glared at her over the black Lumiere stone clutched in her hand. A flaw cut the stone in half lengthwise, hampering its ability to drain and contain magic. She needed a pure specimen. One capable of stripping miles of magic, then begging for more. You'll get your stone as soon as it's ready. Aurelore shook her head. Not good enough. The word now reverberated in her chest, growing louder and more insistent with each repetition. I need it now. You said 2 hours, sputtered the fat one. His teeth were impossibly white compared to his compatriots. And she'll get it within 2 hours, Dirk put in. He cut a glare at his comrade which shut the red-faced man right up. Can I wait 2 hours? Aurelore turned the flawed stone in her hand, and its pale gray inclusions sparkled in the flickering Lumiere crystal's light, entrancing her audience. Her lips turned down at the sight. They were the sour notes jangling her nerves. A song thrummed through her hand as she tapped a nail bitten down to the quick against those imperfect facets. The stone's influence swelled as it reached for the right pitch to shatter the glass house magic had made of their country. But it broke instead of resolving into that perfect, nullifying harmony. Her fingers convulsed, squeezing the imperfect rock until its vibrating vertices dug into her palm. It wasn't strong enough to break the magic's hold on Shayari. But she was. She just needed more of the rock, purported to be antithetical to magic. And she needed it now. How she hungered for a perfect specimen blacker than the space between stars, a nadir to the magic's apotheosis, so she could do God's work. It must be straight from the earth. Rip it from her very roots. It must be raw and free of inclusions. It must be pure, Aurelore insisted. As she fondled the rock, an old saw ghosted back to her, and her knees flexed, readying for that first jump. The past reached out for Aurelore. Small hands calloused from the bowstring clasped her upper arms and turned Aurelore toward the gray mist curling around 2 pallets stacked high with boxes of all sizes. They mutated into trees. The mist crooked a gray finger inviting her to come as it rolled back, revealing a hopscotch board. Aurelore shook her head. This wasn't real. Not the mist, nor the tree-shaded copse, nor the gay laughter of girls knocking off after their afternoon chores. Give us 2 hours and you'll have your rock. Swear it. She shoved the crystal under Dirk's nose. His startled breath misted its uppermost facets. She was done bartering. His lips curled back from his yellowing teeth. I swear it. Get that thing out of my face. Dirk raised a hand to knock the crystal aside, then froze, his eyes widening in horror as gray tendrils extruded from the stone. Letters floated past in a runic script, symbol by symbol, stacking up like the boxes towering over them, until it had spelled out the terms and conditions of their bargain. Shadowy tendrils wound around them, binding Dirk to his word. The promise flashed once, crystallizing into a thing with substance and consequences that dropped around their necks. Then the fivesome receded into a gray haze. A thin black cord connected their promise to the stone in Aurelore's hand, darkening its occlusions. Before Aurelore could crow with delight, the obdurate past surged forward, knocking her back to her childhood. It refused to be denied a moment longer. Witches and woe, sang the little girl she'd once been, as she hopped onto the first square on that fine summer's day so long ago. Witches and woe, agreed the 6 blurry girl shapes, her sisters once upon a time, as they took up the chant. They stood in a line outside the board traced into the mud, clapping their hands and stomping their feet to the beat of the odd little tune. Sunlight dappled them, shining in their braided hair and smiling eyes. The adversary knows. They clasped their hands to their stricken faces and faked a swoon. Aralor landed on the second square. The adversary knows. It's I unseen sows, said her sisters, pointing now to their wide-open eyes. Discord in those, Aralor supplied as she skipped the next square and picked up the water-smoothed river rock in time to add, non-glowing stones. Her sisters feigned horror at the very idea of Lumir stones that didn't emit some form of light. Beware in darkness grows, they intoned, striking a haunting harmony. Treachery where blood flows, Aralor finished as her sisters and the board faded into the ill-lit storeroom. The fingers of her free hand twitched, seeking the ceramic box her oldest sister always held out at the end of each round, so she could toss a pinch of salt over her left shoulder to blind the adversary. But this wasn't a silly game children played. And those blurry girl shapes were morphing into the even blurrier woman shapes of the sisters she'd left behind a decade ago. Then they in turn changed to the fleeing shapes of 5 men hustling out of the storeroom, as if their asses were on fire. Laughter fizzed just under the surface as Aralor shoved the rhyme out of mind. The centuries of irrational fear written into each line left a lingering unease behind. There was no adversary, only the superstition of the uneducated. But she wrapped the black stone in a square of heavy mirror-studded cloth before placing it in a lead-lined box, just in case there was a grain of truth in the age-old superstition. The shadows retreated when she closed the lid. As the room brightened, she brushed her momentary unease away. There was no evil entity waiting on the celestial sidelines for the magical world to crack open, so it could slip through. No, there was just the teeth of the massive gears clicking together as they turned the dais in the Iron Mountain. Behind those golden testaments of humanity's genius, her god of industry stood. And he required no magic to function. A smile cleaved her lips as she rose. It was time she readied her acolytes for stage 2 of her plan. She strode out of the storeroom in the wake of Dirk and his men with her head held high and her shoulders squared. The future rested in her hands, and she would see it done. Follow that woman. Why are you crying? Sarn tried to open his eyes, but leading a double life was exhausting, and his body wanted to remain supine for a few hours. 'Cause you scared me when you fell. I'm sorry, Sarn whispered into his son's hair, and Rand fought a giggle when his breath tickled the boy's scalp. Can we have lunch now and a nice adventure? The bells of Mount Eredrin tolled 14 times. Rand's belly gurgled, reminding them lunch was way overdue. Okay, that sounds like a good plan. Sarn sat up and regarded the unfamiliar cavern crowded with crates, sacks, and all manner of parcels. Where am I? Why am I here? The reason floated just out of reach, but Sarn couldn't grasp it. Why is my memory so hazy? What the hell was I just doing? Perhaps he should sort it out over lunch. Rand might be onto something. An open crate caught Sarn's eye. Rand noticed the box too, and stuffed a handful of the half-inch metal spheres into his trouser pockets. No doubt his slingshot was in there as well, since Rand never left their cave without it. I want to go now, Rand said. Sarn nodded and strained his ears, but he could make out nothing other than a vague murmur. Still, those voices echoed from somewhere nearby, and they encouraged him to stay tucked in tight behind a wall of rolled-up carpets. Symbols popped up on his head map: Dirk, Chryso, Gorfin, VR, and Ragnus. Then it all came rushing back: the surveillance, the unknown woman speaking to Dirk and his goons, and his magic recoiling from her. There was something off about her, something unnatural, commented his magic. Yeah, she was that. After the demonic madness of last month, I must find out why she registers as unnatural. Sarn shuddered. Rand opened his mouth again, but Sarn covered it, muffling his son's latest demand. The group was breaking up, and the unknown woman was heading this way. Her trajectory took her between pallets of goods, yet to be unloaded. Sarn cursed. From his crouched position, he could see nothing of her, except a flickering dot on his head map. Something about the woman prevented his magic from getting a firm fix on her. It would have to do, but he'd have to stick close to her or lose the tenuous hold. Damn it, he had to move now before she walked out of range. Sarn waited until the 6 sets of footsteps faded into silence. Dirk and his goons headed for a ramp and the familiar icons of the carters. With luck, the new shipment would keep them busy for a while. Sarn shifted his focus away from them and kept it on the unknown woman as he rose from his hiding spot holding his son. Only she was important. Where she went next might help resolve her identity and whether she was a player in Dirk's latest con. "We get lunch now," Ran reminded Sarn in a tone leaving no room for argument. "You promised." The unknown woman stepped into a staircase and ascended. Sarn let out the breath he'd been holding and nodded. Lunch lay in the same direction the woman now headed. Maybe she had the same plan. "Good. You can carry me there." Ran wrapped his arms around Sarn's neck to ensure he got his way. Sarn smiled as he hurried to a parallel staircase so echoes of his passage wouldn't give away the chase. Thank the builders of Mount Eredren's subterranean stronghold for drilling at least 50 shafts and filling them with looping staircases. It made moving between levels easy. Best of all, his quarry would have no idea he was tracking her. "You don't want to walk?" Ran shook his head. "No stairs. I don't like them. And there are too many." Ran gave the endless spiral a baleful glare. Sarn laughed. His son had the right idea. Though the 200 narrow twisting steps to the main floor flew by since he took them 3 and sometimes 4 at a time. Once they exited the staircase, Ran pointed to the ground and Sarn set him down. He took a moment to check his head map and grimaced at the throng of people moving about this corridor, and every single one connected to it. Ran handed him his cloak back, and Sarn donned it while he considered alternative routes. Only, there wasn't a good candidate other than the north-south transept he was glaring at. A shield-toting soldier in antique armor screened Sarn and his son from view, though Ran kept poking his head around the statue's leg to peek at the goings-on. His son found the hustle and bustle exciting, but dread tied Sarn's stomach into knots. Why had he chosen this stair? It led out right on the main thoroughfare during one of the most trafficked times of the day. The unknown woman melted into the crowd, then turned south on the transept, heading in the same damn direction as everyone else. High above, the Lumiere crystals dimmed then brightened. Sarn stared at them dumbfounded. Lumiere crystals never flicker. Their glow was as constant as time itself. What could interrupt their light? Just great, that was another mystery he had no time to solve. But there's no one else. So if not you, who will figure out what's going on? Fate's damn his logical half. It was right. Sarn wanted to punch something in frustration, but Ran tugged on his pant leg. "Lunch is that way." Ran pointed south to the middle kitchen. The woman headed in the same direction. Sarn blinked a few times and grappled with a new problem. How could he steal enough food for his small family and an ever-changing number of orphans? Who would watch his son? Ran bobbed up on his toes. His bright eyes anticipated a lunchtime caper, but Sarn knew he'd never get away with it at this hour. The kitchens would be busy churning out meals. And while he contemplated his childcare issues, the unknown woman was getting away. Why was nothing ever easy? The fix he'd put on her yanked Sarn out of the alcove beside the statue. It was a faintly glowing rope towing him in her wake, but it frayed as the distance mounted. Determined to narrow the gap, Sarn caught his son's hand and pushed into the throng. He pulled his hood down until it touched the bridge of his nose and squeezed his luminous eyes closed. Best he reduced the spectacle he made any way he could. Thankfully, Ran's eyes were a matte green except in sunlight. So even though his son looked up at everyone they passed, the intense color of his eyes went unnoticed. Still, tension tightened every muscle in Sarn's body as the crowd swept him and his son up in its chattering throng. Magic leaked out of his pores, making his skin itch as people jostled them, and Ran trod on his toes. Sarn bit his lip and struggled to hold back the tide of power straining to break free. "We protect," said his magic. To which Sarn could only nod. It took all his willpower to keep his magic from cocooning his son. He had to hold it together. His senses stretched out, running the razor edge of his sanity up the textured walls and over the Lumiere murals shining on the people pushing past him. Every damned millimeter of stone told him its name, composition, and what it depicted. The Lithirians. "I don't care." Gripping the grooves between friezes, Sarn shook his head to clear it. But unnecessary details kept flooding his mind. "Papa, are you okay?" No, he was not, but saying so would only worry his son, so Sarn settled for a nod. The movement hammered a spike of pain into his skull at the implied lie, but he let it stand for his son's sake. Before the magic washed him away, Sarn withdrew his hand from the wall, letting go of the only anchor he had to the real world. The crowd shoved him forward. Sarn stumbled and banged his shoulder on an inconvenient statue. There were 100 of them in this corridor, alone. "Emerital Nemai," whispered a rock somewhere ahead. The phrase slammed into Sarn, nearly knocking him to his knees. "Papa, why are the shadows moving?" Ran leaned into Sarn's leg. "What shadows?" Sarn sank to his knees and felt along the textured tiles. He opened his eyes just a crack. It was enough to let the light escape and turn the leaves carved into the marble under his hand green. "They're gone now. You chased them away." Ran tugged on his hand. "Come on, Papa, I want lunch." And the unknown woman pulled a little further ahead, attenuating the fix Sarn had on her. At least 1,000 people icons now separated her from Sarn as the spell pulled him to his feet. Was it curiosity tightening the noose around his neck, or fear? Whatever her business was here, it wasn't harmless. Am I stumbling headfirst into another catastrophe? His gut said yes, and he trusted it. But was the real problem that woman or the 5 men she'd just left? Sarn bit his lip and followed. He had no way to know. "Are we really doing this?" BR turned to his friends and caught their stubborn eyes with his worried ones. Hadn't they seen the flame of fanaticism burning in that psycho bitch's eyes? Either they hadn't, or they were ignoring it, and the shadow play she'd put on to get her way. BR shunted that memory aside, but not before he recalled those shadows reaching out of the gem clasped in her swarthy hand. "It wasn't real," a soft, soothing voice assured. It threaded through VR's thoughts, twisting them toward doubt. BR cast another glance at his 4 mates and hid his dismay. To them, this was just another con. They still believed those black stones Dirk had fenced were worthless dross. "Black Lumiere crystals are a myth," that voice insisted. BR yearned to believe it, but the word black Lumiere crystal scratched itself in all caps across the roseate darkness when he blinked. Somewhere deep inside VR, a small boy shuddered at the mere mention of that nightmare stone. "It's not real. Black Lumiere crystals are just a myth. They don't exist." BR spun toward the voice whispering in his ear, but there was no one there. He was bringing up the rear as always. "Black Lumiere crystals can't exist." BR nodded. The voice was right. Shayari, Hell Mount Eredrin itself, was too magical, and that horrible stone couldn't coexist with magic. Everyone knew that. "Be good or the black Lumiere crystals will get you," warned Baku. At the time she was a pink-cheeked girl of 14, just weeks away from the incident, which left her an unhealthy obsession for teenage boys. Baku's last bow, that green-eyed freak named Sarn, killed her. He denies it, but I know he killed her. Maybe not with his bare hands, but it's his fault. He should have protected her. But Sarn didn't. Now Baku lived only in VR's memory, as that innocent girl telling tales by Lumiere crystal light. She crooked her fingers into claws as she continued her imitation, inviting VR into the memory and the story she was spinning. "Through its eye, the adversary knows," Baku said, as if she were imparting the secrets of the universe. Oh, how her eyes had glowed with merriment. In that memory, she was still untouched by tragedy. VR shuddered. The adversary, now that entity he believed in. Everyone had a foe, so did this new god who existed in 3 persons. It was all very confusing, the good side, but not the dark side. No, that side was razor sharp, and he didn't want to get on its bad side. Of course we are, Dirk snapped, bringing VR back to the here and now, a Lumiere-lit tunnel that connected the storerooms on this level. Their illumination seemed dimmer after Psycho Girl's visit. Were they dimmer? VR glanced up at those veins of luminous yellow striating the ceiling. They branched as they curved around a bend, but their light seemed muted. Was he imagining the difference? Chriso tugged his arm and VR swayed, but not in time. A splintered crate, damaged during shipping, scraped across his upper arm, tearing cloth and skin alike. Blood welled as VR struggled to staunch it with a handkerchief. It's just a flesh wound. Don't you dare chicken out. VR's hands shook. He bit his lip and looked to Chris for help tying off the makeshift bandage, but Chris had fastened onto Dirk's mention of money. Normally the subject would have piqued VR's interest too, but there had been nothing normal about their interview with the fanatic. Just thinking of her made a cold fear clutch VR's heart. She was up to nothing good. Oh yeah. It's funny, but this is the first time you've talked about money. What's she offering for a hunk of that black stone she was bandying about? The others slowed, waiting for Dirk's response, and the shadows leaned in, as if they too were interested in the going rate of black Lumiere crystals. Gold, my friends, she's paying in gold. Dirk smiled and produced a sovereign. He flipped the coin into the air. It spun and caught the Lumiere crystal's light until it dropped into his palm. Dirk clapped a hand over it. Heads say we start now, tails we make Psycho Girl wait. They waited to see what fate would decree, all except VR, who looked away. The sinking feeling in his gut told him all he needed to know. Heads it is. I guess you guys better get started. How big are we shooting for? Ragnes put in, speaking up for the first time since they'd fled Psycho Girl and her sword-swinging sideshow. Since she's paying by the ounce, as big as you can manage, but make sure it's blacker than coal or she might balk. You remember where I got the last batch, right? I do. I'll show him. Gorfin called out from ahead. Good, while you do that, I have some business to conduct. I'll return once that's concluded with your share of the take. Dirk tossed the sovereign coin again. The air thickened, slowing its revolutions so its 2 faces were visible. On one side, a queen regarded them with implacable eyes. On the flip side, a tree shook its branches in disgust. VR blinked and time resumed its normal flow. The coin spun twice more before Dirk snatched it out of the air. What business would that be? Dirk grinned and produced 2 stones. One was milky and cross-hatched with black lines. But the other was a dark gray shading toward black, and its appearance made the shadows dance. VR shuddered. Dirk replaced the 2 stones in a mirrored box. Interesting stones, aren't they? They should fetch a pretty penny. I have another interested buyer for black Lumiere. Dirk's smile turned mocking. So scout out another hunk that's accessible without blasting, okay? Ragnes whistled his appreciation at their leader's audacious plan, but that was Dirk, always one con ahead of the rest. I'm going to make us rich before the week's out. Mark my words. Dirk nodded to them, then sauntered off down a connecting passage, smiling and flipping that damned coin. Well, you heard him. Let's go, boys. Time's a-wasting and there's gold to earn. Gorfin waved and Chriso smiled as he and Ragnes followed. Yes, there was gold to earn, but would any of them survive Psycho Girl's machinations long enough to spend it? VR opened his mouth to voice that question as he caught up with his friends, but something darted past, startling him into silence. What had he almost glimpsed in the shadows? Promises, promises. After 20 minutes, Rand dug his heels in and refused to move. You promised lunch. And they'd passed the only place on this level his son knew they could acquire food, thanks to last month's kitchen caper. The unknown woman had passed them too, presenting a larger problem. There was only one likely destination left for her, the main doors, then the trail down the mountain. Where would she go after that? Into the enchanted forest? Onto a ship? Then where to? Finding out might give him a clue to her identity and why she'd met with Dirk and his goons. A gut feeling her errand was important pushed Sarn to take the next right and wend his way, over his son's protests, to the arcade, then through one of its many arches onto a south-facing balcony. The woman's icon exited the maze around the same time, and after a few minutes' wait, she stepped onto a cliff. Her skirt billowed in the breeze, kicking up waves on the river Nerthal, about a mile or so distant. Only crazy people hiked through Shayari's enchanted forestry. Everyone else sailed about the country since the river Nerthal was navigable from Jacora to Lake Neverthral, which accounted for more than half of Shayari's known landmass. Beyond the 4 large vessels, smaller boats plied the river. They were crowded with silhouettes of fishermen hauling in their nets. Was she headed for one of the boats? Papa was doing boring things again. Ran kicked a statue's taloned foot. His obsession with stopping bad people was a good thing, except when it interfered with lunch. Ran touched the giant eagle's leg, but the marble was too smooth to climb. After delivering one last kick to the statue, Ran approached his father, curious about the view. But the balustrade was level with Papa's waist, and it hid whatever had caught his lanky father's attention. Undeterred, Ran bobbed up and peeked over. Papa's long fingers gripped the coping, digging deep grooves into the stonework. Green sparks danced between his fingers. Papa was doing his silent, intense thing again, making his eyes glow brighter. Magic gathered around him in a shining green cloud. What was Papa doing? Ran sensed a shift in the magic. Glancing over his shoulder, Ran met the Lumiere crystal eyes of a unicorn statue. Its horn was broken, leaving a jagged stump behind. No one was watching him, not even Papa or his magic. Great, if the magic was interested, then Papa would be at this for a long while, maybe even for hours. At times like this, Ran missed his mama. She had no magic to distract her, just a slew of orphans who had all wanted her attention. Ran sighed and scanned the balcony for entertainment. A big cement box with grape clusters in raised relief along its sides attracted his eye and raised his hopes. Ran approached it. Were any of those green shoots edible? Papa? No answer. Ran's shoulders slumped and his belly growled. He patted it, but it refused to stop, and Papa remained at his post, transfixed by whatever the magic showed him. Sounds unlike any he'd ever heard drew Ran through a gap between the giant eagle statue's legs. He paused for a moment until the scent of sausages hit his nose, then shot down the arcade, fronting all the balconies following its scent. His mouth watered more and more with every step. Papa would find him when he was done. Papa always knew where he was, and the thought made Ran smile. Lying at anchor were 2 triremes. Sarn stared at them and racked his brain to identify them. What had Will said about the ferries? Oh yes, one plied the waters between Mount Eredron and points east, and the other followed the river west. The eastern ferry flew Jacora's flag, a white square with a black knight on a rearing horse. The other ferry flew a blue flag with a white dragon in flight, because the old tales spoke of dragons sleeping in Lake Neverthral's depths. A square-rigged vessel rode low in the water to the right of the 2 ferries, but it too made regular stops at Mount Eredron's tiny port. So Sarn ignored it, and the men swarming its decks raising cargo nets full of goods into her holds. The unknown woman likely wasn't heading for that ship. Her destination was either one of the 2 ferries or the last boat in line, the one with an odd crescent-shaped profile. A shiver ran up his spine as Sarn squinted at its bow. It had a figurehead of some kind. Damn the distance, it was too great for even his sharp eyes to make out. But what about the magics? Sarn chewed his lip and considered. Something about the longship's trim profile tickled his memory. Sarn dug his fingers into the coping, and magic arced between his fingers, yearning for a task to perform. It crackled as he let the power build into a green sphere around his hand. Where have I seen you before? There was something about the last boat in line. Its profile nagged at Sarn as his magic launched itself off his hand and plummeted several thousand feet to the ground below. Emerald light streaked across the meadow, dragging Sarn's mental eye with it. As they raced toward the menhirs on the riverbank, the air thickened, slowing his magic's progress until it slammed into a wall. No. Sarn pounded a fist into the coping. As had happened last month, an invisible barrier wove between the standing stones separating the meadow from the beach. But he couldn't see how it was constructed. And his magic couldn't penetrate it or see through it. Damn it. His magic milled around that annoying barrier like an army at loose ends. Look for an opening, Sarn told it. And the magic obeyed. It changed into a pack of gleaming dogs, or maybe he imagined their shining snouts sniffing the space between those standing stones, seeking a break in their spell-wrought fence. It's got to have a weakness, everything does. Even he did, but no, my son is not a weakness. He's my guiding light, my reason for fighting on. Sarn dug his fingers deeper into the scalloped coping, deforming it. There had to be a way past this unexpected obstacle. What don't you want me to see? He asked of those silent stones standing more than a mile away. Last month you tried to stop me from finding 13 dead hikers. What are you concealing this time? They didn't answer, nor did they let his magic or its eye pass. Those standing stones remained as mute now as they were last month, and just as unhelpful. Sarn punched the parapet. Green lightning skittered across his knuckles a second before impact, protecting them. But the balusters had no such protection. They bowed outward from the force of his blow. Sarn didn't notice. He glared at those standing stones. There must be a way past their cordon. Keep looking. His magic nodded, then divided. Half now flowed northeastward and half northwestward inside the ring of menhirs. Sarn blinked to clear his blurring sight until his field of view split to accommodate 3 viewpoints. And in the back of his mind, never far from conscious thought, his map plotted the magic's progress and the locations of everyone and everything within a mile radius. Exhaustion pummeled Sarn. He leaned against a statue of a bearded centaur as the energy draining out of his hand took its toll. But I need to know what those secretive stones are hiding. Emerald light cascaded down the mountainside, but no one crossing the meadow noticed or gave the sunlit balcony a backward glance. Sarn cursed as his magic looped back around for the second time. It still hadn't found an opening. What am I doing wrong? How can a bunch of stones stop me from seeing past them? It didn't make any sense. But through the magic's eyes, Sarn could see only blurs beyond those stones, until a lean youth blundered into his magic. Will? Sarn pushed off the statue and staggered to the parapet, unable to believe his senses. Indeed, Will's icon on his map was caught like a fly in a spiderweb. His friend froze mid-step with 1 foot on the graveled beach and 1 foot inside the circle of standing stones. Will's body interrupted the spell, obscuring the riverbank and the ships. For a heartbeat, the design on the prow of the longship snapped into focus. Dread crystallized in Sarn's gut as he memorized it. Then Will passed through the first ring of standing stones and their concealment spell fell back into place. Sarn? Will spun toward Mount Eredron. Sarn's eyes flew open, breaking the spell. Reality bitch slapped him hard enough to send him reeling. Sarn collapsed on a carved bench. How did Will know I was there? Green light streamed over the parapet and slammed into Sarn as his spent magic returned. For a long moment Sarn sat there holding his throbbing head while stars exploded in his vision. Blood leaked out of his nose, and he wiped it on his sleeve, grateful the dark color would hide the stain. But the design on the longship was branded on his mind's eye, 2 spiky wheels interlocked with a flame dancing over them and a dashed circle enclosing the whole thing. The broken circle could mean death or the Seekers, but what about the flame and those toothy wheels? He didn't recognize the device. The unknown woman, just thinking of her brought his map to the fore. It zoomed in, and an orange arrow pointed to her. Sarn pushed to his feet, even though the balcony's girth blocked his view of the trail and his quarry. Are you heading for the last ship? What about that ship tripped the Menhir's alarm? Whispers in the dark. Chris ignored the whispering voices as he walked deeper into the unknown. It was just the wind soughing through the miles of tunnels down here. But the sibilant hiss dividing his name sent a shiver up his spine. Chrisso. Chris so. A non-human apparition appeared, claws out, in a stop gesture. With its wings folded tight against its armored back, the giant ghost resembled a chalk dragon sketch. But it flickered out before Chris could do more than stare at it, dumbfounded. There are no dragons, not anymore. They're extinct. You're imagining things, Chris. It's this place creeping you out. Why the hell are there no veins of kindled Lumiere crystals here? Chris suppressed another shudder and squeezed the pickaxe's handle. It was a comfort against his calloused palm and a reassuring weight against his shoulder. But the lack of Lumiere crystals in this area and its profound darkness made him quicken his stride. As that breathy voice chanted his name again, Chris bore down on the toothpick sticking out of his mouth. A hot hand landed on his arm, and Chris almost jumped out of his skin as he whirled to face his assailant. "Oh there. Calm yourself." Gore held up both hands in a stop gesture mirroring the dragonish ghost. All the light in this stretch of tunnel fell from his hand. The Lumiere crystal was an orange star plummeting into the rising shadows. "Now look what you made me do. As if this place wasn't creepy enough, you made me drop our only light." Gore cursed and chased after it, but the Lumiere stone had a will of its own. Down the crystal rolled toward a darkness so deep, no light could penetrate it. "Well, don't just stand there. Someone grab it." The crystal picked up speed as it caromed up another slope, in contravention of gravity, taking its comforting nimbus with it. A dragon outlined in a gray just lighter than the darkness, kicked the glowing stone the rest of the way up the steep grade. Then it too vanished. "When the lights go out, spooks shamble about," whispered a disembodied voice. "Who said that?" Chris turned, expecting to see something, but his dark adjusted eyes found only empty shadows closing in on him. Because ghosts can't talk to the living. Death stole their voices, silencing all who crossed that mortal veil forever. Am I losing my mind? Who said what? Gore demanded. I got it. Ragnus shouted from somewhere behind them, and indeed, an orange nimbus was approaching. I'll take that. Gore seized their sole light source from Ragnus, and his shoulders slumped in relief. He waved them to follow as he plunged down the left turning. Without exchanging a word, Ragnus and VR trailed after him. Chris hurried to overtake his weaker friends. Vil was soft and doughy. Rags was whipcord and bone thanks to a recent illness, but Gore was shifty and slim enough to slide through the cracks without his boyhood mates. Not on my watch. Chris flexed the muscles of his free arm. He was built solid like an ox, so if Dirk and Gore's latest con involved some level of danger, and they always did, it was best he met it before Rags and Vil. Neither was much use in a fight. Are you okay? You're awful jumpy. Ahead, Gore's shadow swatted cobwebs aside, and perhaps even a few spiderwebs. God only knew what was down here in the forgotten bowels of Mount Eredron. Something scaly brushed against Chris' arm, and transparent claws plucked at his clothes. Chris slapped those spectral hands away, but their dragonish owners surrounded him. As they chanted, their leathery wings rustled. Ghosts and ghouls and sallow fools lost with tools and bloody drool. Oh, how they cool. Oh, how they cool, 'neath the land where tyrants rule. Shut up. You're not real. Chris shouted. His injunction echoed through a cavern that faded to black beyond Gore's puny light. But it had no effect on the figments of his overactive imagination. Their calloused hands caressed Chris as they passed him, still muttering that disturbing rhyme. But ghosts can't speak to the living. Unless you're dead too, rasped that disquieting voice in his head again. A hand plucked Chris' sleeve. He slapped it away. Easy, it's just me and I'm quite real. You didn't see them? Them who? Gore made a show out of looking around, then settled his dark eyes on Chris. There was pity in their depths, as cold and clear as a midwinter morning. You're letting the shadows spook you? Bill's the one spooked. I've got my eye on the prize. Chris charged past Gore, then slowed because he had no idea where they were going. Dirk had brought Gore down on that initial foray, not him, and that still rankled. What did that shifty lout have that he didn't? Muscles rippled as Chris clenched his fist around the pickaxe's handle. Something caressed his cheek. Chris swatted it aside and tangled his fingers in sticky silk. Shaking his hand did no good. The strands clung on even when he rubbed his hand against the coarse fabric of his trousers. "Hey, you got that right." Bill's scared of his own shadow. Gore twirled the Lumiere stone in his hand, blurring the edges of its orange nimbus. Its halo contracted a little more with each breath they took. "True," Chris said as he rubbed his eyes. He was imagining the light dimming and the shadows crooking beckoning claws. "Come hither, come join us in the dark where all things are bound," they seemed to say, but that was nonsense. Shadows couldn't speak. But dry skellions can. Chris laughed. Dry skellions aren't real. Was he really arguing with himself? Chris rubbed his eyes again, determined to make them stop playing games with the light. "There's no army of light thieves down here waiting to pounce. That was just an old tale dreamed up by a drunken bard. Turn right here." Gore gestured with the orange Lumiere crystal in his hand. But as he led the way to a long decline, its light turned a brownish hue. Shadows pressed in on them, contracting the Lumiere stone's light to a pinpoint, then it flickered once and winked out. Chris froze. A Lumiere crystal never extinguishes. It can't. The back of his neck prickled. Someone was watching them. A bony shoulder banged into Chris, Ragnis's, judging by the leather fringe. Rags was such a clothes horse. "What the hell was that?" BR asked, his voice rising with fear. "Nothing but Lumiere crystals acting strange. If you give me a moment, I'll fix that." Gore trailed off, and the dull sound of rocks striking each other commingled with curses. "The ground's moving. Guys, Shut up. It's all in your head, Vil," Ragnis said, rounding on their friend. Click. Click. Fecking fire kit's good for nothing. Guys, the floor, it's... You're imagining things. Pebbles rolled past. Chris stepped on a crack and backpedaled as it widened. The ground's caving in. Run. Chris pushed a bony shoulder, Rags's most likely, and shoved his boyhood friend ahead of him. Oh shit, oh shit. The ground dropped out as Chris leapt onto a gray island in the black and skidded to a heart-pounding halt. "Chris!" Rags shouted. "I'm okay." Hinges squealed in protest, drowning out Chris's answering shout. He shoved his fingers into his ears to block out the sound. But it was inside his head, scratching at his sanity. Metal slammed against stone, and its reverberations shook his perch. Chris hoped his friends were okay. And if they aren't, there's nothing you can do to help them right now. A muscle worked in Chris's jaw as he threw his arms over his head to protect it from the hail of pebbles pounding him. This was all Dirk's fault. And he'd make that rat bastard pay if he made it out of here alive. Chris danced aside to avoid a broken foot as larger stones smashed into his island. Every move he made rocked his precarious perch. His temporary refuge was fast shaking itself to bits. Soon it would be as gone as the ground around him. I must get off this rock. There's got to be solid ground around here somewhere. The whole cavern couldn't have collapsed. Chris pushed such thoughts out of mind. There was no room for doubt, just action. And if he fell to his death, so be it. At least he died while trying to escape. No light filtered in. Darkness so thick, Chris could almost walk on it surrounded him. And he felt scales. What the hell? Darkness is a serpent, hissed a sibilant voice. Its open jaws offer death, but its kiss promises life. Just a touch, just a taste, and you'll fall under its spell. Who said that? Chris searched the dark. Its totality blinded him, but not his hands. They registered the brush of cold scales. Chris recoiled in horror. Something bony struck Chris from behind and pushed him into the black. He screamed, but the battering ram propelled him across the gap into a slab of cold iron. Hot breath stirred the hairs on the back of his neck, and a smooth metal surface reflected two glowing snake eyes, one on either side of his body. The sight gave Chris a jolt. He was pinned between a giant lizard's head and a door that hadn't been there before. Holy shit, fear chased its tail inside his head as Chris scrabbled for a handhold. Through the door, he heard his friends calling for help. And that was unacceptable. Get a grip. They need you. You're no good to anyone like this. The mental pep talk shocked Chris back to rationality. Forget the door. So, it wasn't there before. It's there now. Deal with it. But as Chris felt along the door, he couldn't help staring into those eerie blue eyes. They looked amused. Maybe it wasn't going to eat him. Maybe it had another fate in mind, but what could a giant reptile want from someone like him? Chris glanced over his shoulder to put the question to his captor. But the reptile played the glow of its eyes over the door, highlighting a gap beneath it. Was that an invitation to dismount? Chris dug his fingers into that crack and hung there as his cold-blooded captor disappeared. Only 2 cold spots on the back of his tunic remained where the creature's nostrils had been, proving it was quite real. Chris shuddered. If that thing returned, he had nowhere to hide. Nor could he hang around forever. His arms were already tiring. Glowing ice rolled over his hands, encasing them to the wrist. Claws clicked on stone somewhere above, then a massive reptilian head pushed through the solid steel door. Oh God Almighty, were there 2 of them? At least this one wasn't corporeal. The words "help me" died on Chris's lips. A dragon blinked watermelon-sized eyes at him. Blue flames ran around its pupils, outlining a black ovoid. Spikes ran down its back, and they undulated in a fell breeze. No, there weren't 2 giant reptiles, just the same one toying with him. The creature's disturbing eyes confirmed it. What would you give? An arm? A life? What would you give for the prize you seek? Asked a breathy voice, not at all what he'd expected. Gone were those sibilant S's. What are you talking about? Chris swung his legs up and probed for a toehold, but the rock was smooth and his boots slipped off. So did his fear. If this thing was bent on eating him, it would have done so by now. Reptiles don't talk to their prey. Rags? Vil? Gore? Anybody? What would you give? Asked the dragon. Its head filled the tunnel, and its tensed body flickered as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. Chris sized up his captor. Was it a ghost gone horribly wrong? Something rammed the door above Chris, and the screech of claws on metal made him wince. The dragon canted its head to see, but it was merging into the cold, numbing Chris. Ice crept down his torso, and he convulsed. Help me. What would you give to release a thief? The dragonish ghost asked in disgust. Chris. Ragnus shouted. Fecking Flint. Gore cursed his fire kit again. His friends' voices were mere echoes when they reached Chris's ears. Was the dragon the fantasy, or the voices calling him? Chris bit his lip to keep from screaming as pain rocketed up his back, then faded as a cold, scaly body brushed against his side. Not another one. Chris squirmed, but to no avail. His new captor wound around him and squeezed. A forked tongue licked the blood seeping from a gash on his cheek, and its fetid breath stank of graves and moldering things. Chris breathed through his mouth so the stink wouldn't choke him, and tasted ashes. I know what he'll give, one of his friends, said the dark thing constricting him. Oh God, he was right. There were 2 of them, but they weren't on the same side. Worse still, neither one was on his side. Choose now and you can breathe again. It must be his choice just as it was ours to jail him. What would you give Chris so? She asked, but her voice was becoming angrier and more sibilant as it faded out. An arm? A leg? A life? What would you give to release a thief? Somewhere close by VR screamed, but the sound choked off. Was his friend all right? What the foo? Rain's shout cut off with a thud. You're all a bunch of sissies afraid of the dark, muttered Gore. Click click. Fecking Flint. Decision made, said the sepulchral voice of the giant serpent loosening its coils. A loud clang followed by the sound of something large, heavy and metallic falling made Chris shout a warning. "Get down." Then he was flung through pitch darkness. Chris laughed as his feet slammed into solid ground again, sending a shockwave up his spine. Had it all been some terrible waking dream? A skeletal hand clapped over his mouth. "There are no dragons or dragon shifters anymore. Think of coins, gold as sunshine, dancing and fine wine," whispered a voice in Chris' ear like the sighing of a grave. "Forget your fears. Spill no tears. Your goal is near." The shadow spun away, releasing Chris. Its robes swirled as a spark flew from Gore's madly striking hands. Click. Click. Foom. "It's about fecking time." A tongue of orange flame licked away the darkness around Gore's upraised fist. In that flickering light, coins bobbed and spun. And the floor shined, reflecting those beautiful, beautiful coins. Chris staggered forward with his hand outstretched to catch those gold coins, and the darkness released him. It swept out of the tunnel, carried on a breath of cold foreboding and bitter laughter. It was just a touch, just a taste of the adversary's grace. Party crashers. While Sarn waited for his headache to abate, he watched the unknown woman's icon shrink on his head map as she strolled across the meadow. "Come on, board one of those boats so I can stop watching you." Because none of those ships were on his head map. The damned thing ended at the beach, rendering the river Nerthal, and everything in or on it, as a featureless white ribbon. While Sarn stood there, Ran was unusually quiet. The lack of demands finally registered, and so did his son's location. Sarn pounded the parapet in frustration. This was his fault. He'd let the mystery absorb him to the exclusion of all else, and now his son might be in danger. A unicorn statue gave him a well-deserved stink-eye as he wended around more statues. Sarn fought the urge to punch the plaster creature. Ran was only 4 and too curious for his own good. But you should have been watching him. A guitar riff interrupted the blame game Sarn was playing and losing. He hit the arcade at a run but had to slow so he could squeeze past statues of monsters long forgotten by legend. Tusks protruded from everywhere on the hulking marble creatures, and they caught on his clothes when Sarn slid between them. How the hell had Ran fit? By crawling. Sarn dropped to his belly and wriggled through the gap between the statue's legs. Damn the Lithurians and their obsessive need for statuary in places where they didn't belong. The Lithurians echoed his magic, but Sarn ignored what had become a constant refrain over the last month. Once through, Sarn replaced his hood but stayed crouched behind a planter. A profusion of leaves hid him until his sixth sense confirmed there was no one except his son about. Rising, Sarn approached a long table cluttered with the remains of a feast. Quite a few people had made inroads in the offerings, judging by the stacks of dirty dishes. And in the middle of all those half-eaten culinary creations, Ran stood on tiptoe, straining to reach the remains of a multi-tiered cake. A bare inch separated his son's grasping fingers from the fluted cake dish. Sarn scanned the balcony one more time, and his green gaze passed over statues of writhing figures as he removed a burlap sack from his pocket. "Papa, help me. I can't reach it." Ran never took his eyes off the confection tempting him. Sarn shook his head and moved a plate of fruit in front of his son. "Have some of these first, then we'll see about the cake." Ran scowled but plucked a strawberry from the pile and ate it without complaint. Sarn ruffled his son's hair and confronted the feast. Hunger made him dizzy, or maybe it was fatigue ganging up on him. How long had it been since he'd slept for more than a couple of hours in a stretch? At least 2 weeks, and that day had been a strange one. Sarn had woken late that afternoon with Ran beside him, and no memory of fetching his son from his babysitters. Their cave had seemed different too, but not in any identifiable way. There was just a lingering wrongness about the place, which was why Sarn was avoiding it. Better to err on the side of caution for his son's sake, and besides, Ran liked roaming around the mountain with him. Sarn sank onto a ladder-backed chair close to the table. A mile or so yonder, the unknown woman finally boarded a boat, the longship with the flame and toothy wheel icons carved on its prow. And she vanished from his map. "Eat, Papa." Rand shoved the plate of fruit at Sarn, then resumed trying to reach the cake. His darling boy had a one-track mind when it came to sweets. A good idea, Sarn said between bites. He set Rand on his lap so they could share the vegetables, meats, cheeses, and other healthy foods on offer. While they ate some of everything, including a small slice of carrot cake, Sarn slipped his foot out of his too large boot. Magic trickled through a hole in his dingy sock into the flagstones. It quested after Dirk and his goons. What were they doing? What was their part in whatever the unknown woman was doing? Something illegal? While his magic searched, Sarn munched on a sausage roll and loaded up his sack without regard to the portability of the items he consigned to it. Everything mixed together, but Sarn paid it no mind as 4 of Dirk's cronies vanished from his head map. Where had they gone? Where was Dirk? Had he followed the wrong person? Dread twisted Sarn's gut into knots. A plate clattered to the ground and spun on its edge like a giant white coin. Sarn stared at it, unable to look away. What if I chose the wrong trail? Then backtrack and choose the right one, said Nolo, second in command of the Rangers, in one of his many lectures. Start with what you know and work backward to where you went astray. The right path will stand out to you. Hearing his master's voice, even in memory, snapped Sarn out of his trance. Dirk was the mastermind. All his spying had made that quite clear. So Dirk's friends were the diversion. He could ignore them. Find Dirk, Sarn ordered his magic, and it raced through Mount Eredren's innards searching. Lights kindled on his map. Pale gray for the citizens of Mount Eredren, regardless of their social standing, and white for the child standing next to him, licking cinnamon frosting off his fingers. At least Rand was occupied. His other gift was keeping an eye on the boy too, so he didn't have to. Where are you, Dirk? Not in the storeroom or anywhere on that level. What happened to the Carters and their goods? The plate stopped spinning and toppled on its side. Rand stomped on it to quiet its tapping. Grateful for the sudden silence, Sarn squeezed his son's shoulder. Then finally Dirk's icon lit up on his head map. What was the man doing in the lower quarters? Only the indentured had business there. It was suicide for anyone else to frequent that level. What the hell is going on? Sarn pushed to his feet, then recalled his boot. He donned it, breaking his connection to the mountain, but the fix stayed. Dirk's icon was locked in his magic sight thanks to their run-in last month. Come on, we have to go now. Sarn swung the sack containing the remainder of the feast over his shoulder. Gravy oozed between its stitches and seeped into his cloak. He grimaced at the smell. Oh well, sorting it was someone else's problem. His responsibility ended at the fetching of said food. Sarn held out a hand to his son and Rand took it. Where are we going? Down, Sarn grimaced at the oblique reference to the squalid place where he lived. You mean home? Home, the word slammed into Sarn and the truth tripped him up. Their cave wasn't a home. It was just a place where they slept until he could find somewhere safer to live. But Sarn kept his comments to himself while he checked the corridor for witnesses. When he was certain they were in the clear, he led his son into the arcade connecting all the balconies on this level. Not yet, I've got something to do first. Can we go on a nice adventure now? I don't know. The lower quarters was a crapshoot. Sarn never knew what to expect down there. He checked on the unknown woman, but she was still out of his sensing range, presumably on that ship. He could pick up her trail again if she set foot on shore. Or I could just go look at her vessel after I find out what Dirk is up to. Now that sounded like a good plan, and Rand might consider that a nice adventure. Sarn smiled and steered his son around a group of glaring statues as a new thought occurred to him. I should ask Will to check the harbormaster's logs. Knowing the ship's port of origin and where it was bound might shed some light on the unknown woman and her dealings with Dirk. But to discover both, he'd have to stop avoiding Will. Not something Sarn was ready to do yet, so he ground his molars. Since their awkward conversation in the tunnel last month, Will had tried to talk to him several times. Maybe he should find out what his friend wanted. An uneasy feeling stirred Sarn's gut at the idea, but before he could become mired in nebulous worries, his son's last comment registered. Sarn almost tripped over his own feet. Sarn caught himself on one of the statues in his path and met the gimlet stare of a marble woman. She looked right through him, sending shivers up his spine until he looked away. He must have imagined that cold intelligence lighting her crystal eyes. She was just a statue, like the thousands of others littering this place. Still, Sarn felt a disquieting urge to hurry back to the rough tunnels claimed by the indentured. There were no creepy statues down there. "Papa, can I?" Rand bounced on his toes. His eyes glittered with anticipation. "Can you what?" Sarn's mind caught up with the conversation, and he froze. On the other side of a marble phalanx, children laughed and played. Rand tugged him toward them. "Can I play with them?" Rand pointed at yet more statues standing sentinel by a portal. Beyond those stony soldiers, silhouetted children cavorted in the sunbeams bathing the balcony. Rand gave the group a longing look. Sarn let the silence speak for him. Until he could obtain legal custody of his son, the answer was no. But Sarn kept the truth to himself where it could depress only him. Rand's expectant face fell a little more with each step away. How could he tell his son the truth? Rand was a secret Sarn kept from the world. A secret in danger of coming out if he didn't find a way to put Dirk and his cronies behind bars. Perhaps Dirk's business in the lower quarters right now was the key. Sarn hoped so as he dragged Rand away from the children and their carefree games. The silence between them chafed until Sarn broke it. "Someday," he said, wishing he had a better answer to offer his crestfallen son. Unwilling to concede defeat, Rand shot him a determined glare. "You promise?" But he couldn't, not when his future belonged to another. So Sarn remained silent as they wended through less populous tunnels. When a pedestrian blundered into this corridor heading the opposite way, Sarn squeezed his eyes closed. But he kept one mental eye fixed on Dirk's symbol and the mystery he represented. One he would solve right now if fate smiled on him. Echoes of his son's unanswered question haunted Sarn. It chased him to a staircase leading to the lower quarters, and the oppressive dark biding its time in its nooks and crannies. Not even the glow of his eyes could dispel those shadows for long.